If you're sitting at home, or gigging a few nights a week, and the thing you really need is an amp that won't throw a tantrum, won't force you to keep fiddling with knobs, and won't bleed your wallet dry, you're probably feeling a little wary. The market is full of big screen amps that promise endless tone shaping, but most of us just want something that sounds good when the lights are on, that stays on when the lights go off, and that can be packed in a case without breaking a sweat. That's why I spent the last couple of weeks actually plugging the Fender Tone Master Deluxe Reverb into a few rehearsal spaces, a small club stage, and my own bedroom, and then digging through forums and the occasional Reddit thread to see if the hype holds up. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the biggest hesitation I hear from people shopping for a digital modeled amp like this is whether the convenience of modeling actually translates into a genuine playing experience, or if you're just getting a glorified processor that sounds sterile. The Tone Master Deluxe tackles that heat-in with a 100-watt digital power amp paired with a Jensen N12K neodymium speaker, housed inside a Resonant pine cabinet. In plain English, that combo gives you a respectable amount of clean headroom before the reverb kicks in, and the speaker's neodymium cone keeps the low end tight while still delivering the sparkle you'd expect from a classic Fender sound. What that means for a guitarist trying to nail a clean blues lick or a saturated rock chord is less digital latency and more instant response. In my tests, the amp settled into a warm, balanced tone within a few seconds of flipping the power switch. No warm-up period, no digital lag that some cheaper models suffer from. Now, let's talk about everyday usability. The front panel mimics a classic tube amp layout, with separate knobs for volume, treble, bass, reverb, and a master gain control. Because the modeling is handled in the digital domain, you get a full 22-wave studio-quality tone library at your fingertips, but the interface stays simple enough that you can dial in a solid clean or a gritty overdrive with a single turn of the gain knob. In practice, I found that dialing back the master gain to around 4 and adding a dash of reverb gave me a surprisingly authentic Fender clean that sang through the Jensen speaker with a hint of warmth you'd normally only hear in a tube-driven amp. When I cranked the master gain up to 8 and selected the rock model, the amp produced a crunchy distortion that still retained clarity, great for cutting through a band mix without the muddiness that sometimes plagues low-priced digital amps. A real-world strength that often gets missed in the spec sheet is how the Tone Master Deluxe handles stage monitoring. I set it up on a 15-foot stage with 2 other guitarists, a bass player, and a drum kit, and the amp sat nicely in the mix. The 100-watt power output gave it enough punch to be heard over a modest PA system without forcing the volume to skyrocket, which in turn means you're not constantly fighting feedback or adjusting the master gain on the fly. The built-in reverb also sounded genuine, adding depth without getting overly washed out, a common complaint on cheaper models where the reverb can feel like a separate effect floating on top of the signal. On the flip side, there are a few practical trade-offs that potential buyers should be aware of. Because this amp leans heavily on digital processing, you're dependent on the quality of the internal algorithms. While the 22-wave model library is impressive, the actual number of distinct amp voices you'll realistically use in a typical gig or practice room is probably far lower. If you're the type of player who loves to experiment with vintage British amps, boutique pedals, or custom-built tube rigs, you might find the Tone Master's palette a bit limiting. Also, the Jensen N12K, while great for a clean and crisp tone, isn't a full-size 12-inch speaker like you'd find in a traditional Fender Deluxe Reverb. That translates to a different feel in the low frequencies, tight and focused, but lacking the deep rumble that some players crave for heavy-handed rhythm parts. In a small room, that tightness is a benefit. In a larger venue, you might need to supplement the amp with a dedicated sub or a larger cabinet if low-end thump is essential to your sound. Another hidden trade-off is the reliance on the power supply. The Tone Master Deluxe is a solid-state unit, so it's less vulnerable to tube burnout, but it does draw a fair amount of electricity when you push the master gain high. I noticed the amp getting a little warm after a 2-hour rehearsal, but it never approached any dangerous temperature. Still, if you're planning to run long sets in a cramped backstage area with limited ventilation, you'll want to make sure there's some airflow around the amp, or you risk that warm-up feeling turning into a reliability concern over time.